April 29, 1945, Dachau, Bavaria, Germany. The soldiers of the 157th Infantry Regiment 45 Infantry Division moved in tight formation through the Bavarian countryside. They had been fighting since the beaches of Sicily. They had crossed rivers under fire, bled in the mud of Italy, punched through the winter lines of France. These were not soft men. These were not easily frightened men. They had been told there was a prison camp ahead, some kind of internment facility, enemy infrastructure to be secured. That was the briefing. That was what they believed. They were wrong. The first sign came before they saw anything at all. It was the smell. It drifted toward them on the wind, like something from the wrong side of a nightmare. Thick, sweet, biological, wrong. The kind of smell the human body instinctively recoils from. Private First Class John Lee later said it hit him like a wall. It was the smell of something that had no right to exist, he would tell investigators weeks later. We all stopped walking at the same time. Nobody gave an order. We just stopped. Then they heard the buzzing. Tens of thousands of flies, a sound like static, like interference on a radio, like the world itself was trying to block the signal of what lay ahead. They moved forward anyway, and then they saw it. The first thing they found was the train. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. It sat on the railway siding just outside the main gates. 42 cattle cars stretching back into the distance like a steel spine. The doors were sealed from the outside. The soldiers approached carefully, weapons raised, instincts firing. Sergeant William Cowling pulled back the first door. He stumbled backward. Inside were bodies, dozens of bodies, stacked like timber, hollow-cheeked, skin pulled taut over bone, limbs frozen in postures that suggested they had died trying to climb over one another. Men. Women, some barely more than children, all wearing the same gray-striped uniforms, all reduced to the same terrible architecture of bone. 2,310 bodies. That was the count they would reach later. For now, there was only silence. Cowling turned away from the car. He walked 3 steps. Then he stopped and stared at the ground. His jaw was tight. His hands had stopped moving. Around him, other soldiers were spreading down the length of the train, opening doors, and each open door produced the same reaction, a flinch, a step backward, a long and terrible stillness. Private Harold Mayer dropped to his knees in the mud, not from injury. He just went down, slowly, like something inside him had given way. No one spoke. Then the gates opened, and they saw the camp itself. The barracks stretched in long, gray rows. The earth between them had been worn to bare dirt by years of shuffling feet, and moving through that gray dirt, appearing in doorways, pressing against the wire, were the living. Except they barely looked it. Thousands of prisoners, some unable to stand, some crawling, all reduced to what one soldier later described as skeletons wearing skin like a loose coat. Eyes enormous in faces that held nothing, no expression, because the machinery of expression requires fuel, requires calories, requires the basic biological resources these people had been denied for years. They stared at the Americans. The Americans stared back. One soldier, a young man from Ohio named Thomas Gebhardt, had a chocolate bar in his jacket pocket. He took it out without thinking. A prisoner, a man perhaps 40 years old, though it was impossible to be certain, reached through the wire and took it from him. And in the taking of that small thing, in the trembling of those fingers, something fractured permanently inside Thomas Gebhardt. He began to cry. He stood there in his uniform, rifle in his hands, and wept in a way he had not wept since childhood. Around him, others were doing the same. Hard men, combat veterans, men who had learned to seal themselves against the visible evidence of death, weeping openly, without embarrassment, because there was nothing left to be embarrassed about. These men had seen war. They had seen friends die. They had seen the work of artillery, the aftermath of air raids, the wreckage that modern weapons make of human bodies. They had stepped over the dead in the streets of Palermo and the fields of Anzio. They had found children in rubble. They understood, in the way combat soldiers understand, that war contains unthinkable things. But this was something else entirely. War has a logic. Terrible, savage, inhuman, but a logic. Soldiers kill soldiers. Positions are taken. Ground is won and lost. There is a brutality that the mind can, with effort, contextualize. File away. Survive. What they found inside Dachau had no logic, no military objective, no strategic purpose. This was not the residue of battle. This was a system, a deliberate, engineered, meticulously administered system for the destruction of human beings. The crematoria told that story. The medical block told that story. The gallows in the courtyard, polished by use, told that story. Someone had built this place. Someone had staffed it, funded it, expanded it, operated it for 12 years. The sadness lasted perhaps an hour. Then it became something harder. It moved through the men like a current, beginning at the edges, at the younger soldiers who had never fully armored themselves against feeling, and spreading inward to the veterans who thought nothing could reach them anymore. The grief curdled, the disbelief calcified into something dark and purposeful. Sergeant Forrest Bing Courier, a combat veteran who had fought from North Africa to this point, stood at the entrance to one of the barracks and looked at the rows of three-tiered wooden shelves on which human beings had slept 6 to a level, stacked like cargo. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Find them." In that moment, the rules of war began to disappear. The SS guards had not all fled. Some had, those with the instinct and the opportunity and the means. But approximately 122 guards remained on the grounds. Some had locked themselves in the guard towers. Others had gathered in the coal yard near the main entrance, having made a collective decision, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of a calculation that prisoners of war would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, to surrender. They stood in a loose group, hands raised, faces arranged into expressions of submission. Their uniforms were still clean, their boots were still polished. They looked, standing there, like men who expected the transaction to be orderly. The Americans moved toward them. There was no shouting, no commands. The soldiers of the 157th walked toward the surrendering guards with a silence that was worse than any noise. The guards watched them come. Some of the guards were young, barely 20, boys in the uniforms of monsters. Some were middle-aged, bureaucratic-looking men who might have been bank clerks or school teachers in another life. All of them had been here. All of them had operated this machine. The American soldiers looked at them. Their hands were white on their weapons. Their jaws were set. The space between the two groups narrowed, and in that narrowing space, something invisible and irreversible was happening. A calculation being made in the gut rather than the mind, beneath language and procedure and all the civilizing architecture of military law. One guard in the front of the group made the mistake of meeting the eyes of the soldier directly in front of him. The soldier looked back at him without blinking. What happened next took approximately 90 seconds. A group of guards, between 17 and 20 men, had been marched to a low concrete wall along the side of the coal yard. They stood with their backs to it. The Americans arrayed themselves in a rough line, perhaps 8 feet away. No formal order was given. Lieutenant William Walsh moved to the right of the line. He looked at the guards. He looked at his men. He said nothing. But something passed between them. A current, a permission, an acknowledgement that all of them had arrived at the same place simultaneously. One of the guards said something in German. Nobody translated it. Then it was noise. The first shots came from the left. Then the whole line opened. The concrete wall absorbed the sound and threw it back. The guards fell in the disorganized, terrible way that human bodies fall when struck suddenly by high-velocity rounds. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but in a simple, graceless collapse, like puppets whose strings have been cut. 17 men. Some reports say 28. The exact count would later become a subject of deliberate ambiguity. It was over in seconds. The Americans stood in the ringing silence. The smoke drifted. Nobody moved. Then someone turned and walked away. Then another. And one by one they dispersed back into the camp, as if what had just occurred behind them was something they had already left behind. Word moved through the camp in a way that defied language. The prisoners, those who could walk, those who could crawl, those who had been caged here for months and years, began to stream toward the areas where they had heard the gunfire. They did not yet understand what had happened, but they understood something fundamental had shifted. When they found the remaining guards, 3 or 4 who had been separated from the others, cornered in buildings, dragged from hiding places, the Americans did not intervene. They stood back. One prisoner, a man who had been in Dachau for 4 years, found an SS guard cowering beneath a vehicle. What happened next? Multiple witnesses confirmed. The Americans watched without moving. They watched it happen. They watched and did not stop it, and later some of them, in private moments, said they were not sure they should have. One soldier, whose name was deliberately omitted from the subsequent report, said simply, "I don't know what justice looks like, but I think I might have seen it." The camp dissolved briefly into something ungovernable, screaming in a dozen languages. The sound of the living discovering, through some register deeper than thought, that they had survived the unsurvivable. It was neither glorious nor clean. It was human. General Henning Linden arrived at the camp in the early afternoon. He moved through the chaos with the deliberate pace of a man who knew that calm, even profound calm, had power. He did not shout. He spoke in a measured tone to every officer he encountered. He issued clear, direct commands. His presence had a physical effect on the disorder. It contracted around him, pulled inward, quieted. He found Lieutenant Walsh near the coal yard. He looked at the wall. He looked at Walsh. A long moments passed between them. Linden did not ask what had happened. He said, "Get your men to the perimeter." He said it in the tone of someone establishing a boundary, not just in space, but in time, a line between what had already occurred and what would happen from here. Slowly, in sections, order was restored. The guns fell silent. Soldiers took positions at the gates. Medical personnel began moving through the barracks. The prisoners, many of them, simply sat down where they were, in the yard, in the dirt, in the thin Bavarian rain, and seemed to be waiting for something, though what exactly that something was no one could have named. The camp was secured. The war, in this small corner of Bavaria, was effectively over. But something else had begun. 3 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker arrived with a notepad and a camera. He was methodical. He had the training and the disposition for methodical work. He walked the perimeter of the coal yard. He photographed the wall. He measured the distances. He collected testimony from 15 soldiers and 3 officers, all of whom described the events in slightly different terms that nonetheless all arrived at the same conclusion. The report was thorough. Its language was precise. It did not editorialize. It stated that approximately 17 to 28 enemy prisoners, who had formally surrendered and were therefore protected under the Geneva Convention, had been executed by members of the 157th Infantry Regiment. It stated this clearly, without judgment, as a matter of documented fact. The report noted the condition of the camp. It noted the train cars. It noted the crematoria and the medical block and the gallows. It included photographs. Dozens of photographs. The complete report, the evidence, the testimony, the photographs, was assembled into a file and transmitted up the chain of command, where it landed on the desk of a general who would be required to make a decision. General George S. Patton received the report on May 3, 1945. He read it in full. Every page, every photograph. He sat for a long time. He was a man who understood war in a way few people in human history have had the opportunity or the misfortune to understand it. He had prosecuted it with a precision and ferocity that his enemies, his superiors, his own men, and history itself had recorded in permanent detail. He had little patience for sentiment and less for excuse. He stared at the photographs of the coal yard. He stared at the photographs of the train cars. He set the file down. Then he wrote a single line in the margin of the cover sheet and closed it and handed it back. Different accounts describe the exact phrasing differently, but all accounts agree on the substance. The investigation was dropped. No charges were filed. No courts-martial were convened. No records of punishment exist. The report was classified and quietly buried, where it would remain for decades until historians, working through declassified archives, pulled it back into the light. Patton, by some accounts, reportedly said that he would be damned if he would prosecute any soldier for shooting a man who had done what those guards had done. Whether or not those words were spoken exactly, the outcome was the same. The file disappeared, and the men of the 157th Infantry Regiment returned to the war, carrying what they had seen in Dachau like weight that never fully left them, because weight like that doesn't. The liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, remains one of the most debated events of the Second World War. Not the discovery, not the horror. Those things are beyond debate. The debate is about the 90 seconds at the coal yard wall. Historians, military ethicists, and legal scholars have returned to it repeatedly across the decades. Some argue unambiguously that what occurred was a war crime, That the protections of surrender exist precisely because moral consistency cannot be contingent on the identity or crimes of the surrendered. That the moment you make exceptions, you have abandoned the principle. That rules are only rules when they are hardest to follow. Others argue that context cannot be surgically removed from judgment, that the men who stood at that wall had just walked through 42 train cars, that they had looked into the barracks, that they had held the hands of people who weighed 70 pounds, that asking men in that condition, at that moment, to perform the cold arithmetic of the Geneva Convention may be asking something that exceeds the operational range of human feeling. Patton, whether or not he was right, chose a side, and so the question falls to you. You have now seen what those soldiers saw, or as close as words can bring you. The train, the wall, the prisoners watching through the wire, the faces of the guards arranging themselves into expressions of surrender. If you had been there, if you had smelled that smell since early morning, if you had opened those doors, if you had looked into those eyes, the prisoners, and then the guards, would you have given the order? Would you have followed it? Would you have stopped it? Or would you have stood there, silent, with your hands on your rifle, and understood, for the first and last time, that some moments in history exist outside the clean borders of right and wrong, in a territory that has no maps and no roads back? The soldiers of the 157th never spoke much about it afterward. Most of them are gone now, but the wall is still there, and the question they left behind it has no answer, only silence, and the weight of what it means to be human in the worst of times.